Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Tom Landy. I'm the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture here at Holy Cross. The McFarland Center sponsors and supports a range of programs that explore basic questions of meaning, morality, and mutual obligation. And while the McFarland Center's work is interfaith in many ways, one of the three pillars of our works focuses on Jewish-Christian relations with a group of dedicated faculty colleagues. I see many of them here: Mari Leonard Fleckman, Alan Avery Peck, Dan Bertrand, Neil Lipsitz, Noel Carey, and until recently, may his name be a blessing, Professor Tom Doughton, who was a good friend to us. Together, we've organized events under the aegis of the Kraft-Hiatt Program for Jewish-Christian Understanding. The Kraft-Hiatt Initiative aims to enrich teaching about Judaism, Jewish life around the world, the Holocaust, and Jewish-Christian relations, including through lectures such as this one, summer study in Jerusalem, and other means. Beginning this spring, the McFarland Center is excited to strengthen our work on Jewish-Christian relations by welcoming under our sponsorship the Readings from the Roots Initiative, an online biblical translation project that helps Christian clergy proclaim and preach about biblical texts in ways that don't convey anti-Jewish biases that arise out of translations. Professor Avery Peck is a founder of that, and we look forward to working with and welcoming his team of scholars. So look forward to hearing more about that. For many years now, we were just talking about how many years it's been, we've been fortunate to host Alan Rosen, who is a renowned scholar of Holocaust literature, as our Kraft-Hiatt Scholar in residence. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Rosen back to Holy Cross today. I frequently hear from students about the profound impact he has when he meets with them in the classes, and that's the reason why we bring him back and made him scholar in residence. Among his meetings and conversations today and tomorrow, Alan will meet with students in several classes. He's a lecturer at Yad Vashem, the World Holocaust Remembrance Center in Jerusalem, and has held fellowships at the Fondation pour la Mémoire de la Shoah in Paris and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. He studied under the late Elie Wiesel, the renowned Holocaust survivor and Nobel Peace Prize winner, and is editor of several collections that publish and reflect on Wiesel's work, including most recently Filled with Fire and Light in 2021. Alan now serves as the project director at the Wiesel Living Archive at the 92nd Street Y in New York. He's author of several books, many of which he's discussed here during his visits. The most recent of those is The Holocaust Jewish Calendars, Keeping Time Sacred, Making Time Holy, which was awarded the 2020 Yad Vashem International Book Prize. He first shared about that project in a lecture with us in 2011. Today he's speaking on the survivors among us, today and tomorrow. Please join me in welcoming Alan Rosen back to Holy Cross.
The survivors among us, today and tomorrow. According to my Google search, there are roughly 225,000 survivors still among us in the world. 147,000 in Israel, 80,000 in the United States, and in other countries, South America, Europe, Australia, there are still thousands more. That, interestingly enough, is just about the population of Worcester, Massachusetts. And I make that comparison, not to push it too far, but the idea that the survivors among us are not going to be among us so much longer is emphasized in a unsettling way, in a way that's not done with the population of Worcester, Massachusetts, as far as I know. Some examples of this is from a local museum committee, Boston Holocaust Museum, Museum in the Making, which fairly recently stated as part of their mandate, there will soon be a time when there are no survivors left, end of quote. Or from the International March of the Living, which sponsors yearly convocations of people, students, younger people, older people, Jewish, non-Jewish, going to the site of Auschwitz. So very noble work in many respects, but also utters a similar refrain. Soon, it goes the line, soon there will be no more survivors, end of quote. Time magazine, coming from a different angle, and their article author being Ayelet Gundar Gosher, wrote a few years ago, not many, 2020, the title of the article, How will we learn about the Holocaust when the last survivors are gone? End of quote. And another speaking about Auschwitz's dwindling survivors, meaning that the pool of survivors becoming less and less. And this refrain took on a particularly difficult formulation for me when I was reviewing a book proposal, and the editors of the proposed volume wrote in their introduction, I quote, "With the final passing of the last survivors, the genocide of European Jewries is at last truly becoming historical." End of quote. Meaning, I think they were trying to convey the idea that if there are no survivors, no witnesses, then the historians will be able to be the ones to chronicle what is taking place, and it will be left to them, which may well be the case in a certain mode of seeing things, but it struck me as if that statement, and really all of these statements, are in a sense waiting for survivors to leave the scene, and that there will be some other era that then is ushered in that will give those who survive the survivors a heightened importance in being able to be guardians of this difficult but important history. Let me just for a second bracket, when I speak of survivors, meaning Holocaust survivors, speaking about those who in some place for either all of the time between 1939 or 1945 were in the killing fields of Europe as the Nazis, may they be blotted out, tried to exterminate the Jews of Europe. And there were thank God, hundreds of thousands of survivors that either were in camps, were in hiding, had been able to flee the scene from those killing fields and to be able to start life anew, either in Israel, in the United States, in Australia, in England, in continental Europe, in South America, all over the globe. And those survivors have been the witnesses, the voice to be able to inform our realization of what has taken place. But we thus see that there's considerable discussion, academically and popularly, about what to do now that we're on the so-called verge of having Holocaust survivors disappear from our midst, meaning they've reached an elderly age, and like all mortals, they will leave this world and go to the next world. But to my mind, the preoccupation with the so-called disappearance of the survivors is misguided and is fraught with ethical, social, scholarly, and pedagogic problems, which I'll come back to the way that those problems are implied in these statements that I shared with you above. My presentation tonight, The Survivors Among Us, today and tomorrow, examines what might lie behind this questionable focus on the survivor's disappearance, and sets out what I hope will be an alternative way to think about the survivors among us. As a complement to my discussion, I plan to incorporate short biographies of a number of survivors that I personally have had the privilege and continue to have the privilege of interacting with regularly, and highlight the lessons we continue to glean from knowing them personally, as well as learning about their remarkable lives. Are there any survivors here tonight? There have been, and I know, past lectures from Worcester or from other places near and far. So we'll bring them. They're here in spirit for sure. Before going on and pursuing this this disturbing line of thinking and trying to present an alternative one, I'd like to say my own thank you to Professor Tom Landy, who is constantly, over the past 15 years, I believe, or 15, 16 years, resourceful in being able to make room for me in this amazing, beautiful, aesthetic room. And even more than the room is those who come and engage in this dialogue. There's to share a way that meshes. I can walk around in the microphone. Yeah? Really? How far?
As far as you can walk.
Really? Boston? If I walk to Boston, it's yeah, okay. So better like this, yeah, at least some of the time. So in Jewish life, there's a holiday which comes in the fall, which is called Sukkot, the festival of the booths. And many Jews not only build a temporary booth, which the Bible enjoins us to do, but also take a lot of trouble to decorate it in very beautiful ways. Posters, hangings, trinkets expensive or not so expensive. And it really becomes a lovely atmosphere to dwell in, even though it's a booth, a hut, decorated hut. But there's a certain group, a certain stream of Jews that believe that since those huts are meant to remind us of the journey in the desert that the Jews took following the going out of the land of Egypt, they should not be so fancily decorated, and they're left basically bare. So when one of the leaders of the group was asked, well, what about the decorations? Shouldn't we decorate? He said, I decorate with the people who come into my sukkah, who sit, who join my meals, who interact. They, meaning you, are the decorations here. So even though we have a hall, a room that is beyond beautiful, that you're really the chief attraction. And to thank also the other colleagues that interact during my visits, either sharing their classes or sharing themselves. Professor Lipsitz, whose class I was in this morning, having the opportunity to speak about the important topic of forgiveness in Jewish life and in relation to the Holocaust. Professor Dan Bitron, whose class I have shared in past times and regular at our gatherings, Professor Alan Avery Peck, who also is a resolute supporter, and others who are on hand and probably behind the scenes. There are many. Tom Doughton, who was here for many years, is no longer with us in this world, but we can imagine he's listening in on high. Yes? Don't you think? Yeah. So thanks to all, and it's a privilege to be back. And I'll speak, I think, roughly for a half an hour from now, and then we'll open the floor to questions, comments. There's never a wrong question. So get your thoughts percolating, and there's a microphone already waiting. So this disturbing, anxious waiting for the survivors to disappear from the scene reminds me of a couple of different things, first off. One is to the great Mark Twain, the author of Huckleberry Finn, who is said to have given us the famous lines, "Reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated," meaning that there is a anxiousness already there to have someone leave the scene before their time has come. My teacher, who we mentioned previously, the great philosopher Alistair MacIntyre, once gave a talk in the 1970s when he saw that the previous day he was referred to as the late Alistair MacIntyre, and he in his Scottish brogue, which I won't try to imitate, he said that he had assumed that was referring to his frequent lack of punctuality. There are many different connections to make regarding how the survivors should be among us. And even many years ago, when the survivors were, after their trial and tribulations, that it was not so clear how the survivors should be among us. What should be their role? What should they contribute? Even though it would seem like they, being the witnesses on the scene, would be the ones to go to first, to ask, what was it like? What did you see? What did you experience? What happened? But it was not often the case. The great Raoul Hilberg, formerly in his lifetime of the University of Vermont, and personally responsible for, in his own way, for my own vocation as a try to be a scholar of the Holocaust, that he felt that survivors' testimony, what survivors said, those had gone through the event, was subjective in character and had really no specific role in chronicling the Holocaust. It was biased. And if you wanted to assemble an accurate chronicle of the events, you should go to the documentation left by the enemy contemporary with the events. And you had to train yourself to read that in such a way to draw out to first of all, build the facts of what happened. How did they do what they did? But then to decipher the meaning of those facts. So it was very much looking at the perpetrators. Eventually, one of the great scholars of Holocaust testimony, Lawrence Langer, who recently passed away, he saw in his later years that the writings by Holocaust survivors were not to be trusted, that they were more like pieces of art, and thus they were tinged with all kinds of strategies that may have dimmed the light of what actually happened during those years. So those are only two of what were many different ways that the authority of survivors was called into question. And even someone like David Boder had an element of this in his own research. Now, even David Boder, who's David Boder and how does he fit into this? First of all, I had the privilege of writing a book on David Boder and his interview project. David Boder was a Latvian-born Jewish psychologist who came to the United States, based in Chicago in the 1920s. In 1946, he saw that the Holocaust, to whatever degree it was known as such by that time, was being communicated to an American public via motion picture newsreels. And those motion picture newsreels were lacking in two different dimensions. One, that they focused on the survivors or the victims of concentration camps who looked emaciated, stick figures. One can still, if one has the wherewithal to do, see such footage. But that was being shown, there weren't televisions, there weren't videos, there were motion picture theaters. And before or after the feature film, these motion pictures brought those images of survivors who were only passive figures that had somehow withstood the onslaught of the enemy. They were also, the footage that appeared, silent. There was no voice. There was no story. So David Boder took upon himself to story the story of the survivors, meaning to go to Europe, to go to the displaced person centers in France, in Italy, and in Switzerland. And he was able to do that in the summer and early fall of 1946, and interviewed about 130 survivors. And they are the earliest recordings that we have of survivors, because he lugged along with him an early version of a tape recorder called a magnetic recorder, a wire recorder. And we have those available on a website today entitled Voices of the Holocaust. And he gave great honor in his own way to the survivors that he interviewed. But even he was often skeptical in how he approached the story. And I'll give one very striking sample. It's an excerpt from a interview he did with Abraham Kimmelman, the longest interview that he was able to do, so 2.5 hours. And Abraham Kimmelman was at that time, summer of 46, 20 years old. And he tells of what he went through in extraordinary detail, and also philosophizes over the meaning of his ordeal in extraordinary singular terms. So this is the give and take. Abraham Kimmelman says, "I shall tell you now," he's saying to David Boder, "of a thing that happened only much later, about a year later than what he was talking about before. But since I'm talking about eating, we can just as well tell it here. I was already in a concentration camp. I came to the kitchen once, and I saw a boy sitting over a kettle, which measured 15 liters, 3.9 gallons. Well, the kettle was about 3/4 full, and this boy ate. I asked him, 'How do you happen to get so much food?' And so he said, 'I brought a push cart back from the construction place, and the cook gave me this food.' So David Boder asked him, 15 liters? And Abraham Kimmelman says, 15 liters? Well, it was big. Maybe it wasn't 15, but it was 10, 2.6 gallons. And here I had my dishes, and I also brought my dishes, and I got my food here, and I slipped, and my pot fell out of my hands, and everything spilled on the floor. And this boy that ate 2.6 gallons of soup, as soon as he saw this, he left his own kettle, and he started licking the soup that spilled on the floor. He did it as fast as he could. He devoured it quickly and then returned to his kettle and finished that. Can a man believe it? Is it possible to believe it at all? Even now, he's eating 10 to 15 liters of soup. So David Boder says, do you really believe that a person can eat at one sitting 10 liters of soup? And Abraham Kimmelman says, what do you mean? The case I told you about, I have seen it myself. And David Boder goes on, and he's skeptical of the incident, but he still, to his credit, records it, writes about it in his book. But this is typical, meaning from the word go, we could say, that survivors, because they are speaking subjectively, because they were immersed in the events that happened, because there's only one person, that their own testimony was seen as often distorted and thus non-authoritative. There are other approaches, counter-approaches, such as those by Jan Gross, who in his great book on the terrible massacre of Zimbabwe, he saw one testimony of a single person that had been shunted aside, and he went back and heard it, read it, and built from that an entire history. Christopher Browning did a similar with a labor camp, but still the shadow of the survivors' lack of authority in giving an accurate assessment of what they went through has followed the chronicling of the Holocaust. In contrast, my own personal approach has been guided by the survivors among us. Over 40 years ago, I had the privilege of, along with the survivor, Sonia Weitz, leading a monthly survivors group. It was called, at the organization, Facing History and Ourselves. At that time, based only in Boston. It's expanded exponentially since that time. But we would gather some 20 to 25 survivors and discuss different topics, and particularly about how to present one's testimony to younger people in the classroom. And today it's almost 50 years since I have chosen to make the study of the Holocaust my vocation. And I continue to be guided by the survivors among us. I happen to have the privilege of living in a neighborhood where, at arm's length, one could almost say, there are survivors there to be able to speak to, live among, celebrate among. One is Rabbi Moshe Kruskal. Rabbi Moshe Kruskal. He was a year old when he, his two older siblings, and his two parents, who were prisoners in the concentration camp Bergen-Belsen in Germany, were chosen to be those who would constitute transport 222. Bergen-Belsen became, shortly after he was extricated from there in summer of 1944, became one of the worst places, with not only purposeful death there, but typhus epidemics killing prisoner after prisoner in the later stages of the war. But in summer of 1944, there was negotiated a deal whereby 222 prisoners in Bergen-Belsen who had some connection to Israel would be traded for 222 German Templars who lived in the land of Israel. And the exchange was carried out. And Rabbi Moshe Kruskal now lives across the street from me and has a family of 10 children, each of whom have many children. And that being extricated has given him the chance to live a life that is not only full of beauty and resourcefulness, but in many ways that I won't go into now, has been a tremendous aid to projects I worked on, particularly my book on the Holocaust, Jewish calendars. Feivel Vogeland lives upstairs from me half of the year. The other half he lives in Zurich, Switzerland. He was also a boy, 1 year old, living in Poland. His family, Jews in Poland, were an endangered group during the war, with deportations happening constantly from 1941 on, and even before that, could be lethal to be there. He was smuggled out from his village by his mother, and the rest of his family hid in barns for the rest of the time, up to the end of the war. When the Nazis retreated and the Russians came in, the right-wing Polish militia had their own free reign, and they were anti-Semitic in a murderous way. And his father and uncle, who had survived all the war in hiding, were murdered not by the Nazis, but by the Polish militia. Feivel Vogeland was able to come out from the war. He again made a life with a half dozen children, many grandchildren, and has published the diary that his father wrote during those years, and continues to move between a life lived in celebration and a life lived chronicling the Holocaust, not through his own memories. He was too young for most, but through his connections to the event. And to go more quickly, Robert Krell, who, a child survivor in Holland, has become a leading psychiatrist interested in children's experience during the wartime. Rabbi Joseph Pollack, 2-year-old in the camps of Westerbork and Bergen-Belsen, currently the head of the Rabbinical Court of Massachusetts, an award-winning chronicler on his experience. Mr. Yehuda Katz, who lives some doors away from me, was found refuge on a farm with 14 other Jews in Holland who escaped the clutches of the enemy. And I won't go through the full list, but let me end with almost every day I'm in the synagogue with Mr. Emil Magnus, who, strong at 84, continues to arrive in the synagogue just around the time or earlier than I do, and survived several camps, including Theresienstadt with his family. The distinguishing feature of Kim is that he's deaf, and was at the time that he was in the camp, and still managed to evade the terrible urgency of the enemy to do away with Jews, and he has returned to live a life of strength, of fortitude, of bringing further generations into the world. Living among survivors, then, is being able to see that their lives have been built in such a careful and caring way. I learned from each one of them elements of how to build a life, how to nurture children, how to be able to contribute to society, and much more. The survivor that I'm most deeply connected to is my mentor, my teacher, Elie Wiesel, who perhaps some of you have heard of, have read some of his books, or perhaps heard him speak, who passed away 2016. So he's not a survivor among us today in the flesh, but because his contributions were so enormous and so voluminous, he certainly lives among us. For our purposes today, I just briefly want to touch on his 3 essays that had to do with defending survivors. Were a plea for the dead, published in 1964, a plea for the survivors, published in 1975, a new plea for survivors, published in 2001. And he writes in A Plea for the Dead, I plead for the dead victims of the Holocaust, and I do not say they are innocent. I say simply that we have no right to judge them. To confer innocence upon them is already to judge them. The context for this statement is that in the early 1960s, especially at the time of the trial of one of the leading henchmen, Adolf Eichmann, may his name be blotted out, there was at the trial those who saw or tried to impute to the victims that they had themselves been culpable. They had let themselves be used by the enemy in atrocious ways. And some writers made a lot of that connection. But Elie Wiesel then wrote that that is not something that to pass any judgment on. And the other wing of that is what he saw to be the arrogance of the scholars, of the writers who tried to pass this judgment. And I quote, "This is what I reproach us for our boundless arrogance in thinking we know everything and that we have a right to pass judgment on an event which should, on the contrary, serve as poor and that serve as teaching us that we are poor and that our dreams are barren when not bloody." In A Plea for the Survivors in 1975, where even when survivors gained some credibility, their own contributions continued to still be held at a distance. And he writes, while it's fashionable these days to soothe the sensibility of all minorities, ethnic, social, religious, and others, few seem to worry about offending that particular minority of survivors. Its suffering is exploited, distorted, monopolized, embellished, or debased according to the need of the moment. And the helpless and distraught survivors have no alternative but to submit to let it happen, and even to say thank you. And finally, in his last writing of this kind, a new plea for survivors, 2001, some 55 years after the event. And Elie Wiesel, the spokesman, one of the chief spokesmen for the survivors, having been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, which was in many respects also a validation of his own work on behalf of survivors, that he still writes, despite my insurmountable pessimism regarding the memory of Auschwitz, I did not expect the insults and attacks that its survivors had recently had to endure from all sides. They are unjust, obscene, and ugly. They testify to a lack of sensitivity and humility toward the survivors. It seems that we are angry with them for having suffered, for remembering it, meaning the events that they went through, and especially for talking about it. At the limit, it's as if we are angry with them for still being alive. And that takes us back to the statements that I began with. Statements that show an anxiousness to move on, an anxiousness that almost gives an unsettling feeling that survivors are in the way. If they would only leave the scene, we can go about our work of commemoration, of memory, of moving on with life. And to conclude, I want to come back to the 4 dimensions of problems and implications that I spoke about at the beginning: ethical, social, scholarly, and pedagogic. The ethical problems and implications. Such statements as those we read, in a certain sense, pass a death sentence on survivors. Instead, to my mind, we should give words of strength to the survivors for enduring life and for their enduring worth. The Talmud, the teachings of the Jewish sages of 2,000 years ago, teaches that we, everyone, is required to stand up for someone either over 60 years old or 70 years old. There's an argument which it is. If they come into our proximity, to stand up in honor of their experience, what they've gone through in their life, that they are filled with, saturated with experience. And it is up to us to recognize that and honor. And here it's not talking about survivors in any plain sense of the word, but rather it's talking about any person. So our words, it seems to me, with survivors should aim to match that standing posture, the way in which by standing we are according honor rather than by eliminating and diminishing it. On a social level, we can aim to celebrate these survivors in addition to honoring those among us who miraculously survived, allowing the embodied miracles that they represent. Each and every survivor will say that it's only through miracles that they survived. Those miracles could have come, and often did, at the hands of Jews and non-Jews who were helping. but miracles they were nonetheless. And so each survivor whom we encounter, who we meet, who we interact with, then we can appreciate how they radiate through those miracles which continue to trail them in their life. That will be the glow, not only a radiance of life, but actually of light. It's talked about that in the ancient Jerusalem temple, that the menorah, the candelabra that was there, that it was not meant to light up mainly or only the inside of the temple, but rather the windows of the ancient temple were crafted so the light went out into the world, because such a spiritual center, such a concentration of spiritual worth and value needs not to be cloistered, but rather to be spread, to be shared, to be distributed. And that, in a certain more metaphorical sense, I'm suggesting that each and every survivor is a menorah by whose light we can gain and glean that radiance. From a scholarly vantage point, which is some of us are invested in, the testimony of survivors should be seen, I submit, not simply as an addendum, a kind of human interest story that is appended to the facts, but rather the testimony itself rather constitutes the core of what we know about what took place during that time and what we should know about what took place during that time. So it's a reversal of the usual priorities that are given, placing, instead of having the survivors on the periphery and the facts coming from the enemy, the nemesis, the contemporary documents, rather that the survivors themselves are at the center and the addendum comes in the other direction. And as I mentioned, there are certainly those who see this and act on it, but it still is a fragile dimension of Holocaust scholarship that needs to be righted, and that the survivors themselves can feel the unbalance and will welcome the return to balance. And finally, pedagogically, according to the Jewish calendar, which I wrote a book about during the Holocaust, and am interested in just as a Jew and a phenomenon, person living in our world, that we're in the year 5784, which is dated from the time traditionally computed to be creation of the world, of the universe, and leaving aside the different questions that might come from science, but that traditionally is where it is. The Holocaust itself began just before the turn of the century, in the year 5699, very end. And so really the Holocaust lasted from 5,700 to 5,705. Thus, in the current year of 5784, we are still in the century of the Holocaust. To my mind, this computation links us to the survivors and links the survivors to us. We have shared the century with the Holocaust survivors and continue to share it with them. In our teaching, in our pedagogy, in our commentary, in our transmission of this terrible event known as the Holocaust, that we're obliged to underscore this link, what we have shared, this bond that continues to exist between us, this shared reality of our overlap in time and in space. Thank you.